The most troubling question is not whether Jesus died. Even the hardest critics of the early church rarely deny that. The Romans knew how to execute. They perfected it. Crucifixion was not guesswork. It was a slow, calculated descent into silence. The real problem, the one that refuses to sit quietly, is this: what happened in the space between his last breath and the empty tomb? Because if nothing happened, if those hours were simply darkness, then why did the earliest believers speak with such urgency about it? Why did they insist that his work did not stop at death, but moved deeper? That is where we begin. Jerusalem, 1st century, a city restless under Roman rule. Narrow streets filled with dust, tension, and whispered expectation. The Passover festival had drawn thousands of pilgrims pressing into the city, carrying lambs, prayers, and memories of deliverance. It was a time when history felt close enough to touch. Outside the city walls stood Golgotha, a place of execution, stark, public, meant to humiliate as much as to kill. By the 6th hour, darkness fell across the land, an unsettling detail recorded in the Gospels. By the 9th hour, Jesus cried out and died. Roman soldiers confirmed it. A spear pierced his side. Blood and water flowed. To them, it was routine. Another rebel crushed. But the Gospel accounts do something strange. They linger, not on the cross, but on what follows. His body is taken down, wrapped quickly, placed in a tomb carved from rock. A stone is rolled into place. Guards are stationed. Officially, the story ends there. Yet the earliest Christian writings refuse to accept that silence. The New Testament itself, our primary source, contains fragments that hint at something unseen. In one of the most debated passages, the first epistle of Peter speaks of Christ going to the spirits in prison. Another line declares that he descended into the lower parts of the earth. These are not poetic decorations, they are claims. Quiet, but deliberate. To understand them, we have to step back into the worldview of that time. In the ancient Jewish mind, death was not annihilation. It was movement. The dead went to Sheol, a shadowy realm beneath the earth. Not hell as later imagined, but a place of waiting. A silence filled with echoes of the living. This belief wasn't isolated. Across the ancient Near East, Babylon, Assyria, even Greek thought, there was a shared sense that the dead continued, dimly, beneath the surface of the world. The Babylonian texts speak of the underworld as a land of dust where kings and commoners alike dwell in stillness. Jewish writings, especially those from the Second Temple period, expand on this. Some describe divisions within Sheol, places of rest for the righteous and places of unrest for the wicked. By the time of Jesus, this layered view had taken root. So when early Christians said he descended, they weren't inventing something new. They were placing him directly into that ancient map of the afterlife. But why would he go there? The biblical account gives us fragments, not a full narrative. And those fragments are what have fueled centuries of interpretation. One line says he went to proclaim, not to suffer but to announce. Another suggests he led captivity captive, a phrase that sounds like victory, not defeat. Now, step outside the Bible for a moment. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, does not describe Jesus' descent. But he does confirm something critical, the cultural setting. He writes of Jewish beliefs about the soul's continuation, noting that the righteous pass into a better state while the wicked face consequences. This aligns with the Gospels. Jesus speaks of a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus, both dead yet conscious, separated by a great divide. It is not presented as myth, but as illustration grounded in familiar belief. Archaeology, too, whispers in the background. Tombs from this period, rock-cut, sealed, reused, show us how death was handled. The body was temporary. The soul, that was the real story. So when Jesus died, his followers did not imagine him vanishing. They imagined him entering that unseen realm. And here is where the tension sharpens, because if he entered the realm of the dead, then death itself became a place he could walk into. That idea would have been explosive. In Roman thought, death was final authority. In Jewish thought, it was a boundary set by God. But in the emerging Christian message, that boundary was crossed, not by escaping death immediately, but by stepping fully into it. Scholars have argued over this for centuries. Some say these passages are symbolic, that descent simply refers to burial. Others argue it reflects an early Christian belief that Jesus confronted the powers of death directly, proclaiming victory even before the resurrection. There are even ancient Christian texts outside the New Testament that expand the story. One of them, the Gospel of Nicodemus, describes a dramatic scene where the gates of the underworld are shattered and the righteous dead are led out. Now, historians treat such texts with caution. They are later more embellished, but they reveal something important, not necessarily what happened, but what early Christians believed had to have happened. They could not accept that those hours were empty, because if Jesus truly was who they believed he was, then even in death he would be active. The question then becomes sharper, heavier. Was this descent a mission, or was it simply the natural path of any man who dies? The earliest creeds of the Church include a line that has echoed for nearly 2,000 years. He descended to the dead, not as speculation, as declaration. But what did he do there? Did he preach? Did he liberate? Did he confront something older than Rome, older than Israel itself? The sources do not speak with one voice. They leave space just enough for debate, for mystery, for unease. And perhaps that is the point, because the silence between the cross and the resurrection is not empty. It is loaded, heavy with implication. If something happened there, something real, something deliberate, then the story of Jesus does not pause at death. It continues in a place no living witness could follow. And that is where the trail grows darker, not because there is nothing to see, but because what is there is just beyond the edge of certainty. The stone has not yet been moved. That detail matters more than most people realize, because in every normal death of that era, the story ends quickly, body wrapped, burial completed, memory fading into family grief. But in this case, something unusual happens immediately after burial. Attention shifts from mourning to guarding. A Roman seal is placed on the tomb. Soldiers are assigned. The authorities do not treat Jesus as simply another executed criminal. They treat him as a risk that refuses to die. Now we move deeper into that silent interval, the hours traditionally called the time between death and resurrection. Geographically, we are still in Jerusalem, but now the focus narrows to a rock-cut tomb in a garden area near Golgotha. Archaeological studies confirm what the Gospels describe. These were not shallow graves. They were carved chambers, sealed with rolling stones, cold, dry, hidden from sunlight. Inside such a tomb, silence is absolute. No sound, no movement, no light. This is where the narrative becomes contested, not because the tomb itself is disputed, but because what believers claim happened beyond it cannot be measured. The earliest Christian texts do not describe Jesus as inactive during this period. Instead, they use language that suggests movement into another realm. One of the key biblical references comes from Ephesians, which speaks of Christ descending to the lower parts of the earth, and then ascending, leading captivity captive. Another comes from 1 Peter, which speaks of proclamation to spirits in prison. But what does that actually mean in historical context? To answer that, we must step into the worldview of Second Temple Judaism. At the time of Jesus, Jewish cosmology was layered. Heaven above, earth in the middle, and Sheol beneath. Sheol was not yet the fully developed concept of hell seen later. It was a holding place of the dead, structured in some traditions, chaotic in others. Some texts from the period, such as those found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, show that Jewish groups already debated what happens after death. The idea of judgment, resurrection, and spiritual realms was actively developing, not static. This matters because early Christianity did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged inside this ongoing debate about what lies beyond death. Josephus, writing in the 1st century, confirms that Jewish groups like the Pharisees believed in resurrection and continued existence of the soul. He also notes the tension between different Jewish sects on this issue. While he does not mention Jesus' descent directly, his work confirms that the idea of continued consciousness after death was not strange to the culture. It was expected in certain circles. This cultural background makes the New Testament language less abstract and more grounded. When early Christians spoke of Jesus entering the realm of the dead, they were using familiar conceptual geography. But here is where the tension intensifies, because the claim is not simply that he died and went where all dead go. The claim is that he went there with purpose. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus tells one of the criminals, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That statement has been heavily debated. Some scholars argue it suggests immediate post-death activity. Others argue it reflects theological expectation. Either way, the text refuses to present death as silence. Now consider the Roman perspective. For Rome, execution was finality. Crucifixion was designed not only to kill, but to erase identity. The victim was meant to become an example, not a memory. Roman sources like Tacitus confirm that crucifixion was used for slaves, rebels, and those deemed threats. So from a Roman standpoint, Jesus is finished. But from the emerging Christian movement, something is happening that Rome cannot see. And that unseen dimension becomes the heart of early Christian proclamation. One of the earliest summaries of Christian belief appears in Paul's letters, written within decades of Jesus' death. Paul speaks repeatedly of Christ's death and resurrection, but also implies a victory occurring in the unseen realm. In Colossians, he writes that Christ disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them. This language is not purely physical. It suggests confrontation beyond the visible world. Now we enter the interpretive divide among scholars. One group argues that all references to descent are metaphorical. They say, lower parts of the earth simply means burial. Spirits in prison refers to humanity in general, trapped in sin. Another group argues the language reflects an early Christian belief in an actual descent into the realm of the dead, where Jesus announces victory over spiritual powers and liberates the righteous dead. This debate is not modern invention. It stretches back into the early centuries of the Church. Some early Christian writings, such as those attributed to Ignatius of Antioch, lean toward a literal understanding of descent. Others adopt more symbolic readings. But regardless of interpretation, something is happening after death that is not passive. Now we bring in archaeology again, not to prove theology, but to ground the world.